Imagine for a moment that the United States, the world's greatest power, stops playing its role as global leader and international protector. What would happen to those countries that have built their stability and security under the shadow of its influence? For many smaller nations, this scenario would be a true nightmare. Today, we'll explore 3 countries whose survival could falter if Washington turns its back on them. Special attention goes to the first one we'll mention. It has accumulated so many enemies over time that it seems to have challenged the entire planet. The system of international alliances often resembles a mafia-like scenario. In this theater, the United States acts as the main boss, protecting its circle of allies. As long as it's present, the countries under its wing feel confident, even defiant. But if that support disappears, everything changes. Protection turns into vulnerability, and those same countries that once stood firm could be left exposed, surrounded by rivals, with no one to back them up. Let's now look at one of the most exposed on this list: South Korea. Although K-pop, dramas, and Korean culture have conquered the world, the truth is that this country has placed its entire national security in American hands. If this alliance were ever broken, the consequences could be more dramatic than the plots of its own series. Since the outbreak of the Korean War in the 1950s, the U.S. military presence in the South Korean peninsula has been key to its defense against the North. Without that intervention, South Korea might not even exist today as an independent nation. Currently, more than 28,000 U.S. troops remain on South Korean soil. But they don't just provide troops or weapons. They offer something even more powerful: the protection of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. This nuclear shield serves as a direct deterrent against North Korea, a country whose leaders have proven to be unpredictable and volatile. Without that protection, South Korea would be practically defenseless against any provocation or attack. And this is just the beginning. The other 2 countries on this list also rely on the same fragile pillar. But before we continue, ask yourself, how prepared are America's allies for a world without its protection? North Korea has a very particular way of grabbing the world's attention: missile launches every time a special date is celebrated. It's almost a tradition. But for South Korea, each of those launches isn't just news, it's a real threat. Without the presence of U.S. military forces on the peninsula, the tension would be unbearable. Just a few kilometers north of the 38th parallel, thousands of North Korean artillery cannons point directly at the South Korean capital. Seoul is so close to the border that in the event of conflict, it could be hit within minutes. And if that weren't enough, North Korea also possesses nuclear weapons, while South Korea does not. Its only hope of defense against an atomic attack is to rely on the U.S. nuclear shield. But the threat doesn't only come from the North. South Korea is literally trapped between 2 powers, one it trades with and one that protects it. On one hand, its economy heavily depends on China, its main trading partner. On the other, its security is guaranteed by Washington. This delicate balance forces it to try to please both, though it almost always ends up upsetting both. A clear example was the installation of the U.S. THAAD missile defense system on South Korean soil. Although it had defensive purposes, China interpreted it as a direct provocation and responded harshly. Chinese tourism plummeted overnight. South Korean celebrities vanished from Chinese television. Several South Korean companies suffered retaliation on Chinese territory. Only then did Seoul understand how costly it can be to anger such an influential and nearby neighbor. This episode made one thing clear: If the United States loses power in Asia and China emerges as the sole regional superpower, South Korea will face painful decisions. It will have to choose between two equally difficult paths: bowing to China, losing part of its autonomy, or remaining loyal to its alliance with the United States, enduring Beijing's economic and political retaliation. And the outlook doesn't end there. South Korea also doesn't have a smooth relationship with Japan. Historical tensions coupled with territorial disputes keep both countries at a cold and cautious distance. Until now, it was U.S. influence that pushed both to cooperate, at least on the surface, against the threat from the North. But if the U.S. presence fades, the game will change. Japan could accelerate the development of its military force, becoming an armed and independent power. In that scenario, South Korea would find itself cornered, with North Korea threatening from the north and an increasingly armed Japan rising in the east. The pressure would be simply unbearable. Now imagine this scenario. The United States decides to withdraw all its troops from South Korea. The unthinkable happens. North Korea, always watchful, sees the withdrawal as a green light. And then, without warning, in the middle of the night, military sirens begin to wail desperately in the demilitarized zone. Tanks cross the 38th parallel. North Korea's war machine rolls southward, crossing the Han River. Seoul, a city of millions, descends into chaos. Fear spreads like wildfire. The South Korean government issues an urgent call to the world. The president contacts the UN, pleads for help, but receives only vague diplomatic responses, full of calls for calm and moderation. But this time, there's no one to protect them. Without U.S. backing, South Korea would be completely alone in the face of attack. And realistically, it's very likely that it wouldn't be able to resist. The result could be devastating: a unified peninsula. Yes, but under the North's regime. Everything South Korea has built, its democracy, its freedom, its modern way of life, could vanish, absorbed by an authoritarian ideology. And it's not just its security that's at risk. Its economy, one of the most dynamic in the world, is also deeply tied to the global order that the United States has upheld for decades. Think about this. South Korea survives by selling to the world. Samsung, Hyundai, LG all depend on exports, maritime routes, and international free trade agreements. This system has only worked because the United States has maintained global stability. But if that hegemony fades, the rules of the game will change. Shipping routes could close, markets could become unstable, and supply chains could collapse. A simple disruption in maritime transport, such as a naval conflict, could completely freeze shipments from Korea. The economic impact would be catastrophic. And here's the irony. Inside South Korea, there's no shortage of voices demanding total independence from the United States. But what they don't realize is that true autonomous defense would only be tested the day they no longer have that support. Only then, when the first North Korean missile streaks across the sky above their heads, will they understand that the days of peace were not a right, but a privilege sustained by a foreign power. And for many, that awakening could come too late. In South Korea, not everyone is comfortable with eternal dependence on the U.S. nuclear shield. Some voices, more radical, suggest a dangerous alternative: secretly developing their own nuclear arsenal. With North Korea's constant provocations and atomic tests, this proposal has gained some attention in recent years. However, the path to independent nuclear deterrence is full of obstacles. If South Korea decided to build its own atomic weapons, it would be violating key international treaties and triggering a chain reaction across East Asia. The most likely outcome would be a regional arms race, along with global condemnation and diplomatic isolation. In other words, this idea represents a desperate measure, an extreme option that would only be considered if the country were completely abandoned. The truth is, without U.S. protection, South Korea would be like a greenhouse flower suddenly thrown into a relentless storm. And no matter how modern the neon lights of Seoul may seem each night, if its allies disappear, the country's story could change genres, from an urban romantic comedy to a geopolitical tragedy. Let's now move on to the second country on this list, Taiwan, a nation whose existence is a constant balancing act. Taiwan is in the international spotlight not only because of its delicate geographic position facing mainland China, but also due to its enormous technological importance. This is where the world's most advanced microchips are made, vital to the global economy. Despite its size, Taiwan has resisted for decades, and much of that resilience is due to U.S. support. Back in 1950, when the Korean War broke out, President Truman directly intervened by sending the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait. His goal, to prevent China from seizing the opportunity to take the island by force. Even when the United States officially shifted its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing in 1979, it didn't sever ties completely. That same year, the IET Taiwan Relations Act was passed, allowing the U.S. to continue providing military and logistical support to the island, both during the Cold War and in the years that followed. The Taiwan issue has become a central piece on the chessboard of tensions between China and the United States. Would Washington defend Taiwan with troops? The answer has never been clear. The U.S. strategy is ambiguous, deliberately uncertain. But in practice, the United States has acted as Taiwan's guardian, arms sales, military presence in the region, and diplomatic firmness. In reality, the United States is Taiwan's main pillar of security, and although we currently live in relatively calm times, if tensions in the strait escalate, one thing seems almost certain: Washington will not stand idly by. In 1996, Taiwan experienced one of its most tense moments. In an attempt to intimidate the island, mainland China launched missile tests near the strait. The U.S. response was immediate. It sent aircraft carriers to the area, and with that show of force, it managed to halt a potential military escalation. However, that episode was just a reminder of a constant reality. Taiwan lives on a razor's edge. Even with U.S. support, the military balance is clearly tilted toward the other side. In recent decades, China's People's Liberation Army has undergone colossal growth in technology, numbers, and capabilities. By comparison, Taiwan simply cannot compete. To put things in perspective, while China has over 1,500 fighter jets, Taiwan could barely deploy around 300 in the event of war. No matter how advanced some of its technology may be, and no matter how brave its soldiers are, they face an adversary vastly superior in size and resources. And most concerning, the military. Pressure on the island has only increased. In recent years, Chinese warplanes have routinely crossed Taiwan's defensive lines in intimidation drills. Taiwan's skies witness hostile flights almost daily. Despite this, life on the island continues as if nothing were happening. People work, study, stroll through night markets, sip milk tea, and chat like any other normal day. But beneath that routine lies an uncomfortable truth. The peace they enjoy is fragile, and everyone knows it. Taiwanese people often joke, "The jets flew by today." but we still have to go to work tomorrow. But what if one day those jokes become reality? The calm of Taiwan's citizens doesn't come from naivety. It comes from faith, a deeply rooted belief that if things spiral out of control, the United States will come to their defense, just as it has before. But the big question hangs silently in the air, feared and unanswered. What will happen if one day the United States can't or won't intervene? The apparent tranquility that Taiwan breathes today could collapse within hours. Imagine for a moment that the United States decides to stop intervening in strait affairs. At that very moment, mainland China would act without hesitation, intensifying its pressure, and perhaps even launching a full-scale offensive. Taiwan would be trapped, surrounded by sea and sky. The exports of chips and technology that currently sustain its economy would cease. But even worse, food, fuel, everything essential for survival would also stop coming in. The country would be completely blockaded, and then the bombings would begin. Missiles from China's People's Liberation Army would rain down like a storm on airports, radar stations, and command centers. Taiwan's Air Force would take off to resist, but the numbers would not be in its favor. The skies would quickly be dominated by China, and the coastline would become the entry point for its forces. Troops would land by sea, and soon urban combat would reach the streets of Taipei. The city, once glowing with lights and nightlife, would be engulfed in fire and smoke. Taiwanese leaders would issue a final cry for help to the world. But this time, no aircraft carriers would approach, no Marines would land in their defense. Only words would arrive. Condemnations, speeches, displays of solidarity. But no action. Today, Taiwan maintains diplomatic ties with a small group of countries, sustained mainly thanks to U.S. backing. If that support evaporates, those allies would vanish too. Taiwan would be left alone, isolated, vulnerable. And the gravest threat wouldn't be sanctions or isolation, it would be the real risk of war. Because if China concludes that the United States will not get involved, it would feel it has a clear path to force reunification through military means. And although Taiwan's military would fight with all its courage, the harsh truth remains. It could not hold out for long against the might of a superpower. Freedom, democracy, the island's way of life, could be extinguished. Some still place their hope in the Silicon Shield, the strategic value of TSMC and Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Doesn't the world need those chips? Wouldn't China fear destroying something so valuable? It's true. That shield exists. Many countries fear a technological collapse if war breaks out. But that shield comes with a very clear condition. The United States must remain firmly in place, as the guarantor of peace. If that guarantor disappears, if global protection weakens, then China might decide it's better to act quickly, take control, and resolve by force what diplomacy failed to achieve. And if that happens, Taiwan wouldn't just lose its freedom, the entire world would pay the price. From mainland China's perspective, if war destroys Taiwan's semiconductor factories, they can be rebuilt over time. But what cannot be recovered is a missed opportunity to achieve reunification. In their view, that historic goal takes absolute priority. The challenge, however, isn't just military. More than 20 million people live in Taiwan under a free and democratic system. Imposing Beijing's control wouldn't be something achieved without considerable resistance. This is precisely why the conflict in the strait won't be resolved through simple negotiations or temporary agreements, but beyond the ideological clash between democracy and authoritarianism, Taiwan holds enormous strategic value. Located at the heart of the first island chain in the Pacific, its position is key to containing China. For the United States, keeping Taiwan within its sphere of influence allows it to block China's naval expansion into the Western Pacific. But if Beijing manages to dominate the island, it would open a massive breach in that defensive chain, allowing China to project power directly into deep Pacific waters. Such a shift would transform the strategic balance in Asia, seriously weakening the presence and authority of the United States in the region. That's why Washington is not willing to lose Taiwan so easily. Even so, within the United States itself, doubts and divisions persist. Many wonder whether it's truly worth going to war with a nuclear power like China to defend an island. The possibility of direct conflict between superpowers sparks fear, and if one day the United States cannot even protect its own territory, other allies will hesitate to intervene. Nations like Japan or Australia may sympathize with Taiwan, but without U.S. leadership, they would hardly confront China alone. In such a scenario, Taiwan could become just another sacrificed piece in the grand chessboard of global power, and the great unknown remains. If the island were to become completely isolated, how long could it hold out on its own? The recent war in Ukraine has deeply impacted Taiwanese thinking. Watching the Ukrainians fight, supported only partially by the West, many on the island ask themselves, if something similar happens here, will the world truly act? Faced with that uncertainty, Taiwan has not chosen to remain idle. In recent years, it has strengthened its defensive capabilities, knowing that in a crisis, the first thing that matters is its own preparedness. Taiwan has intensified its defensive preparations with determination. It has acquired more air and naval defense systems from the United States, invested in the development of long-range missiles, and built domestically manufactured submarines. It has even reinstated mandatory military service for 1 year. Many young people who thought they could avoid that duty had to put down the video game controller, smile with resignation, and begin preparing for a much more serious reality. All of this follows a clear strategy: to turn the island into a kind of armed hedgehog. That is, even if Taiwan lacks immediate foreign support, any attempt at invasion would be extremely costly for the aggressor. Moreover, Taiwan hasn't limited itself to military efforts. It is working to expand its network of allies beyond the United States, strengthening ties with Japan, European countries, and other regions of the world. The goal? To reduce its exclusive dependence on Washington. But no matter how hard it tries, one inescapable truth remains. Taiwan is geographically too close to the Chinese giant, and the power gap between them is enormous. That's why, in an extreme scenario of total war, if the United States chooses not to intervene, it's highly likely that Taiwan would have no way to resist. That is the cold, hard reality. And hopefully, that day never comes. Because if it does, this vibrant and free island could be swept away and shattered by the dark winds of history. Now then, this kind of scenario isn't new. There's a clear precedent in the world. Israel. In the Middle East, there's a saying that sums it all up. God gave oil to the region, and gave Israel. This small country, which at its narrowest point measures just 20 kilometers across, is surrounded by historic enemies. Yet it has managed to survive for decades in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. How has it done so? The answer lies in its people, and in its backing. Since its creation in 1948, when it was attacked by 5 Arab countries just one day after declaring independence, Israel has faced constant threats. But it has also had powerful support: the United States, During the Cold War, the Middle East was a chessboard for superpowers. Some Arab countries allied with the Soviet Union, while Israel remained firmly on the American side. Every time the nation faced an existential crisis, such as during the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, U.S. military and political assistance arrived swiftly. That protection has been, to this day, one of the key pillars of Israel's survival. Perhaps Taiwan is walking a similar path. The big question is whether, when the time comes, it will receive the same kind of support. In 1973, Israel faced one of the most critical moments in its history. Egypt and Syria, in a coordinated offensive, launched a surprise attack during Yom Kippur, a sacred Jewish holiday. The Israeli army, caught off guard, suffered considerable losses in the early days. The situation was so dire that, according to reports, the Israeli Prime Minister was already contemplating the use of the most extreme weapon, nuclear bombs. It was a desperate option, a final measure that would have forever changed the history of the Middle East. But before reaching that point of no return, the United States intervened with a massive airlift operation. Planes loaded with weapons and ammunition flew non-stop to Israel. Thanks to that immediate support, the country managed to stabilize the front and eventually turn the tide of the war. Since then, the bond between the two countries has become unbreakable. Today, U.S. aid to Israel not only continues, it has grown stronger. Each year, Washington allocates over $3 billion exclusively for military support to Israel. This assistance allows the country to acquire the most advanced military technology in the world. Stealth F-35 fighter jets, defense systems like the Patriot, and of course the famous Iron Dome. All of this has been made possible thanks to U.S. funding and technology. Thanks to this missile defense shield, millions of Israeli citizens live with a sense of protection that was once unimaginable. There's no longer a need to sleep each night in underground shelters, hearts racing at every alert. The truth is, a significant portion of Israel's arsenal bears the stamp of the United States, but the support isn't limited to the military. In the diplomatic arena, the United States acts as an impenetrable wall. At the UN and other international forums, whenever sanctions or condemnations against Israel are proposed, the U.S. steps in to veto or block any resolution. It has created a kind of diplomatic shield for Israel, allowing it to move freely on the global stage despite opposition from many countries. This level of support has led many to call Israel the favorite child of the United States, and, like any favorite, it behaves accordingly. Firm, defiant, sometimes relentless with its neighbors, because it knows that no matter what happens, it has someone backing it. However, that security has come at a cost. Tensions with Arab and Muslim countries have only grown, and resentment has intensified. But for Israel, that's a burden it can bear, as long as the world's most powerful superpower remains on its side. Although Israel has signed peace agreements with countries like Egypt and Jordan, its presence in the Middle East continues to generate friction. For many, it's a thorn that has never stopped hurting. Some, like Iran, have even publicly declared their desire to wipe Israel off the map. The reality is alarming. Israel, with fewer than 10 million inhabitants, faces hostility from an Islamic and Arab bloc that numbers in the hundreds of millions. It's an uneven fight, like a small country facing 100 enemies at once. Today, its existence is safeguarded primarily by one factor: the unconditional support of the United States. But what would happen if that protection suddenly disappeared? The scenario would be critical. Israel would be surrounded by hostile forces in every direction. To the north, Hezbollah in Lebanon waits for an opportunity. To the south, Hamas has never let its guard down. Beyond that, Iran continues developing its nuclear program and strengthening its influence networks across the region. Until now, stability has been possible thanks to Israel's military superiority and the constant backing of the United States, which acts as a deterrent to its enemies. However, if Washington decides to withdraw from the board, that balance would collapse within days. The most likely outcome wouldn't be an immediate full-scale war, but rather a coordinated offensive unlike anything seen before. Hezbollah could empty its arsenals, launching thousands of rockets from Lebanon. Hamas wouldn't hesitate to open a new front from Gaza. And Iran, seeing the opportunity, might greenlight more aggressive attacks, even firing long-range missiles at key targets inside Israeli territory. At first, the Israel Defense Forces would likely respond effectively. Their training, experience, and technology would allow them to contain part of the assault. The Iron Dome would work tirelessly, intercepting missiles in the sky. But as days passed, the constant pressure would wear down their defenses. Casualties would mount, and eventually strategic points would begin to collapse. Imagine Tel Aviv reduced to rubble, Jerusalem engulfed in smoke. At that moment, the Israeli government would turn to its allies, only to find silence. The powers that were once its friends would now respond with indifference, or simply look the other way. Russia and China might seize the vacuum to expand their influence in the region, but they wouldn't act as protective shields. Neither would offer the military and diplomatic support that the United States has provided for decades. Without its main ally, Israel would face one of the greatest crises in its history. And the lingering question would be, how long could it survive alone? As the world changes, priorities shift too. If the United States were to step away from the Middle East conflict, it wouldn't be surprising to see many powers driven by self-interest begin to align more closely with Arab and Islamic countries. The reason? Oil, strategic alliances, and geopolitical power. On that new chessboard, Israel would be left alone. Europe, for its part, would likely issue statements calling for a ceasefire and offer limited humanitarian aid. But committing troops or risking involvement in a war, that's another story. Without U.S. support, Israel would have to rely on its own means, and that is no easy task. The annual military aid currently flowing from Washington would disappear. The supply of weapons and ammunition would drastically decline. Although Israel possesses an advanced military industry, its territory is small, and its resources are insufficient to sustain a prolonged high-intensity war. Over time, without external logistical support, attrition would be inevitable. Moreover, the United States has played a silent but crucial role in allowing Israel to maintain its advantage as the only nuclear power in the region. Without that backing, other countries, like Iran, could soon attempt to level the nuclear playing field. And if that happens, Israel would lose even its most powerful card: nuclear deterrence. There's a concept known as the Samson option. According to it, if Israel were to face the brink of annihilation, its final response would be devastating: to use its nuclear arsenal as a last resort, dragging its enemies down with it. A desperate measure for a no-way-out scenario. For decades, the United States has prevented the situation from escalating to such extremes. But without its presence, the balance would collapse. Israel would not only be surrounded by military threats, it would also face intense international pressure. Countries with which it has had past tensions could seize the vacuum to condemn it. In international bodies, impose sanctions, sever diplomatic ties, and enforce embargoes. And if that happens, the economic consequences would be devastating. Israel's economy depends on exports and the tech sector. Without access to international markets or technological cooperation, the country's stability would be seriously compromised. That's what an Israel without the United States would look like: surrounded, isolated, and facing a future full of uncertainty. Imagining an Israel without U.S. support is, for many Israelis, like envisioning a country without ground beneath its feet. For generations, the people have lived with the certainty that in times of crisis, Washington's hand would always be there to intervene, to mediate, or even to protect. But if that certainty fades, the impact would be profound. Fear, chaos, and social uncertainty would grip the nation. Talent would begin to emigrate, investments would vanish, and many would seek refuge far from this land marked by conflict. The economy would falter, and the demographic landscape would shift. The image of a strong, invulnerable Israel could crumble in the blink of an eye. Losing the support of its one great ally would be like hanging suspended over an abyss, with an ocean of enemies waiting below. Israel, which for years defied its opponents with confidence, could suddenly find itself exposed and alone. Because when a country has pulled the rope tight with so many and no longer has anyone to defend it, only one threat remains on the horizon: destruction. This story is not unique. South Korea, Taiwan, even Israel share a pattern: small nations that have entrusted their security to the shelter of a superpower. But international politics has never been a fair playing field. It's a jungle where the weak often pay the highest price. Relying on dominant power is a strategy many consider inevitable, though risky. It wouldn't be the first time the fall of a giant drags down its smaller allies. Just look back at the collapse of the Soviet Union, when those who depended on it were left adrift overnight. And although the United States still stands strong, its hegemony won't last forever. What will happen when the balance of power shifts? Are those nations prepared to stand on their own? Instead of waiting for the umbrella to break, perhaps it's wiser to learn to walk through the storm, because as the old proverb says, he who depends on a mountain may see it fall, and he who depends on a person may see them flee. In the end, the only true protection is self-sufficiency, because there are no eternal empires, nor protections that last forever. When a giant rises, everything that grows around it lives in its shadow. The small, the fragile, find protection in it, but also dependency. The shrubs that grow beside that enormous tree do not do so by choice, but by necessity. They have no other option but to cling to the soil and hope. Hope that the tree remains firm, that it doesn't sway, that it doesn't fall. Because if it collapses, it won't just take down its own branches, it will also drag everything growing at its feet. The small ones will not be able to escape. They will be crushed without even having the chance to resist. That's the nature of things, and that's how the world works. The weak who shelter under the strength of the powerful live with the hope that such power never fades. Because when the one who protected them falls, all that remains is disaster.